Launching into a new retailer comes with a huge amount of excitement, but also a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. Today, we're going to be talking about how to successfully launch in a new retailer, all the things that can go wrong, and how to solve it. So, first up, I'd like to introduce my guest for the day's conversation, Eric Carl, who's the founder of Hello Partners. With nearly 14 years at Target under his belt, Eric now leverages his deep retail expertise to help brands, suppliers, investors navigate the complex consumer goods landscape. He's on a mission to help drive sustainability, customer centric growth without burning through resources or losing focus on what matters most. Eric has launched his own brands as well, and so it comes with a lot of experience here. Joining him is also Deepti Desai, who's the co-founder and CEO of Crystal. She's a Silicon Valley veteran with a rich background in product management and engineering. It held leadership roles at Uber and other growth stage startups. At Crystal, she's really working to revolutionize B2B commerce by simplifying the complexities of EDI. As we're going to talk about in today's conversation, that really becomes the backbone of managing retail operations on a week-to-week basis. So together, Eric and Deepti will bring a wealth of knowledge to talk through how to successfully launch in new retail environments and the challenges that can come with those. Eric, Deepti, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having
Excited
me.
to be here.
Awesome. So Eric, starting with you, I'd love to know, what does a successful retail launch really look like from the inside? And I know you put together some visuals to kind of walk through here. And so if you want to pull those up, let's dive into what that process really looks like.
Yep. Give me 2 seconds. You come show up okay?
Looks good. That's good.
All right. Excited to be here. I guess I'm old. Let's just start with that. So I've got a lot of experience in my prior career working on the retail side of things. So I've been intimately involved in launching a lot of emerging brands into the retail space in a mass retailer versus Target. Then I left in 2018 with a friend and built a women's vitamin supplements company. So I've gotten that brand up and through into retail launches, built another one in the intimate wellness space. So I've done it from a founder operator angle, and for the past almost 3 years, have an agency where we work across a lot of emerging brands and even private label partners, all within kind of the emerging brand ecosystem. But to your point, launching into retail is both a big opportunity, and it also comes with a lot of risk into what pressure it can put on a business model of a early stage company. And so really being intentional about how you build, when you build, and then, there's no, even the very best brands out there, I've seen, them have some challenges in launching into retail. But it's not you're ever going to completely mitigate it, but how do you reduce the likelihood or of any of those issues? And we'll kind of walk through that a bit more today.
Awesome. I love it. Let's get into it.
All right. So the example I'm going to use, because Dipti's here, is actually going to pull. I know the audience is going to be far more in the food bev space, and I've definitely have experience in those. But the through line connecting to our sponsor with Crystal today, we're going to actually use a hair care example, which is to a T, same things you would do if you were in the food categories, beverage categories. And this one's just a relatively recent one too. So I wanted to kind of walk through this one kind of from pre-selling stage all the way to now launched into retail stage. We'll talk and kind of unpack that as well. Please chime in, Jordan, with questions. So, if I think holistically as a brand founder, operator, the three big milestones when I think about retail is really three big steps. There's the sell-in. Okay, I want to find, my targeted retail partner where I hope to be on their shelves with my brand. There's really all that preparation that, once you go from yes, all the work really begins, and it's generally a sprint at this stage because, of course, big retailer timelines never line up perfectly to what it, needs from a brand standpoint. And then you're there. And really the way I frame it up oftentimes is, getting into retail is probably a third of the battle. Now your job is really clear, is you need to earn that shelf space. And, best case scenario, you're earning incremental shelf space, whether that's stores or SKUs or even incremental retailers too. So how can you be successful in that, then when you're there from a sell-through perspective?
Eric, I love this in terms of framing this process, right? And to zoom out a bit, one thing I always like to share with brands is first off, in the early stages, you really need to work towards identifying and achieving product market fit. So making sure that your actual product is solving a need for consumers and that they're looking to buy products like yours in order to have the best chance of success. Because, right, like a lot of retailers are really excited to bring on new products, but your success or failure is determined a lot by if people actually want what you're selling, which at the early stages, that might be the main question you're looking to solve. Sometimes that's by getting into retail and testing it out in market. And then kind of once you figure out you have product market fit, it's a lot about just expanding your operations and seeing if that process scales. Another question I have for you is, do you find that selling into and succeeding with every retailer is pretty similar, or does each retailer have so many differences that it's like starting over each time?
Ooh, good questions. I first want to just respond and kind of give you an amen to your first part on
Yeah.
product market fit. Um, because a lot of times the reality of it's getting more expensive to grow brands digitally, right? There's this, I would need to really unlock some physical retail distribution. Sometimes with brands is what works digitally doesn't always necessarily translate or correlate perfectly to a physical environment. And so sometimes I think brands without great product market fit see, well, once I get into retail, then the customers who are there and the foot traffic there will solve for it. The reality is two things, and it does it sounds a little bit doom and gloom, but it's much harder in retail today for early stage brands than it was 10 years ago. And it couldn't be more the case today with all the tariffs and all these things kind of clouding over, but it's more expensive for sure. Private labels a headwind in certain instances. A lot of those first mover advantages, that were there years ago is no longer there. So there's no chance to be the first kombucha, the first oat milk, and those types of things are years ago. And so it is more challenging. And so where I just want to land is if you don't have product market fit and you go into retail, it is going to be really expensive to try to right size that. And the reality is you're up against a little bit of a ticking clock of you're not going to get years to figure that out. Is you got to actually showcase velocity and sell through and hopefully some incrementality back towards those retail buyers. And so it can be very, pivotal for small companies if you're not there and you try to go into retail. So what is the best advice? It's really simple is how can you de-risk going into retail? What are ways you can pressure test that product before you get into there, before you put all those chips into the pot and try to be successful in the retail environment? So product market fit again is so paramount, and I think more and more so because things continue to change working in regional, doing even customer feedback stuff, any of those things you can do just to pressure test your packaging, your messaging, and all those things before you get into the retail, it's worth the time to get it right. Ensure you are set up for success before you go in to even sell in.
I love that, Eric. And I will get back to my second question soon too. But I also want to ask, does expanding in new retailers typically solve problems for brands or create new problems?
It's a great question. Um, I think there's for sure um, the product opportunities that scale can provide in beneficial costs, and those types of things. As a business model and business entity going, and even though it's, just repeating more retailers, kind of to your last question, the short answer is every retailer has their own nuance. They have their own fee structures, their own terminology, their own objectives. What may sell well in one regional grocer up by me, a Hy-Vee, may or may not sell well in a Fred Meyer out west for one reason or another. And so even though you think you've gotten product market fit in one retail environment, that doesn't put you on a path to easy street and you're in scale up mode. So I think oftentimes because you're not just you're going to be still on the hook to growing that first retail partner, and you're trying to take on more. And generally speaking, it just creates more complexity. Is probably the short answer to your question.
Yeah, I mean, let me tell you, I remember when I was running my brand T Squares, we sold caffeinated energy bars essentially made with tea. And, our sales were like doing okay. We are selling e-commerce, a couple of retailers. And I remember getting a opportunity to sell into like 180 Jewel Osco doors for
Mhm.
like one of the Albertsons banners. And on one hand, we're like, okay, it's risky. It's more of a conventional channel. Our product's still new, but the opening order was going to be larger than any other order that we've received. So the volume looked really enticing, and the top line gross revenue number of how much we would sell also looked really enticing without understanding chargebacks, like we had to sell through a KeyKey, so distributed
Yeah.
chargebacks, like new warehouse opening fees, all the other things. And the long story short with that, right? Like we got in, there ended up being a lot of complexities of making sure we were right on the shelf in the right place. We ended up being merchandised in 5 different locations around the store. It was impossible for customers to find us, and ultimately, we ended up getting, discontinued from the shelf because our product sell-through wasn't there,
Yep.
and after all the distributor chargebacks and fees, we ended up basically losing money on
Mhm.
that partnership versus if we had never done it before or, in the first place. And so I think it's so important to understand this whole process and how it works in the timeline so that you can set the right expectations and set yourself up for success.
Yep. 100%. I think the oldest when I worked on the retail side of things, the first movers, the first disruptors, they were going toe to toe with big CPG. Annie is competing against Kraft, Cliff Bar against, Nature's Valley and those types of things. And so the model that existed then is you needed to be in all stores because that was the only, there was, you need to be in national campaigns. You had to replicate big CPG playbooks to be successful. The value or benefit for brands today is there's no set path you have to take from point A to point B. You could start in Erewhon, you could start in co-op, you could start just digitally, and there's all these different ways you can get into retail. And the today more often than not when I work with brands, I think it's oftentimes better to not be in all stores. It's not a black and white rule, but generally speaking, retail is a momentum game. And
Mhm.
it's always easier to build up, but if you overshoot and you're not hitting velocities and you come down, again, it's really hard to right size that buzz, that perception, and that relationship. It's always easier to build upwards, kind of under promise, over deliver, and then you're getting into this momentum game. And so the value of being in a smaller subset, you reference a number of doors, is you can plow more resources, which are always finite, into a much more smaller set than if you were national. And in this couple of stores in this region, a couple of stores in that region, it's hard to canvas those. But if you can start regionally into Whole Foods and you can get in the car and do the road trip and get in front of the team members, which is a really important critical storytelling opportunity, you're able to take some things you may not be able to do in a scaled up distribution. So more often today, because of the challenges, I'm actually encouraging brands start smaller, whether that's retailers or even if you're at a big mass retailer, smaller in door count and work your way upwards. I think the latest of the latest, that seems to be the most sustainable pathway to success, but also underscoring that you don't have to always follow the path that brands have taken already. You can be successful, starting small, figuring things out, and then figure once you got that and get into the right product market fit, and then hit and scale. I think sometimes people too often open their social channels and look at all these buzz that's out there. The perception versus what's the reality is one of those things. Just having been a founder and operator, it can be just, it can play games with you, right? As you, the keeping up with the Joneses per se.
Right.
I think that's always one of the hardest things to compartmentalize as a founder operator is like, yeah, but all these brands, why aren't we doing what they're doing? So that's kind of the push and pull, just like you did, Jordan, is like, yeah, there's the dollars, and I've seen all these other brands do it. So clearly that's the pathway I need to take. It's a double-edged sword there.
I love this kind of framework of sell in, preparation, and sell through. What's next as you kind of think through these?
Yeah, so let's just go through it like, okay, step one, I need to like engage with retailers, right? So I mean, oftentimes and I'll kind of frame it up from a bigger retailer. They're more structured line review process. you know, is you show up to those meetings, and you're trying to talk about how is my gonna land into this retailer's, assortments. And really like as I think about like what does the buyer want to hear back when I was a merchant, is they're not looking for you to replace what's in their current assortment and just trade dollars across brands that already exist. There is what are the ways that you can bring incrementality, and there's lots of ways to kind of talk about that, and I'm just using a real life example, and I think most of this was the actual verbiage we used in the pitch deck is, one, this was this brand Boldify. It's a hair color, kind of hair loss coverage brand, doing really well, which a lot of early stage brands getting a ton of momentum on, DOC, especially on Amazon. So, this is a category where customers, it's a little bit taboo. And so they will go to Amazon to search or be more comfortable to buy it there. So it does really well digitally. So one of the reasons of this is like, hey, buyer, there's a huge opportunity you're missing not being in this category. So this is an incremental category opportunity you don't have. We're clearly doing incredibly well. So you're already kind of de-risking from a buyer perspective is we're not starting from scratch. We have a tremendous amount of sales. You can see the reviews, so it's product that works. And then lastly, speaking a little buyer language is, we're not going to be the lowest price point in your assortment. We know that. And so, but we think there's a great opportunity to kind of help the consumer trade up into more premium products, and we'll also help you grow your margin at the same time. So really what you're trying to do in the sell-in process is frame your brand into their strategy. If I were to like, I'd say the cardinal sin of a brand going into a line review meeting, if there's a 30-minute meeting, is if the brand team is talking for 30 minutes. And so really what I recommend is, if possible, and I was doing it this morning with some brands and retailers, is I like to start and ask from the buyer's perspective, what are your key strategic objectives for this category? Well, that does is automatically turns from, a one-way conversation into a collaborative conversation. Two, then I can use those sound bites that they're talking about in terms of their strategic priorities, and I kind of weave that into my presentation, and make sure my story ladders up to those strategic priorities. And if I know they're focused on driving incremental consumers, increasing their overall profit mix, that's kind of how I craft my sell-in story. And then most importantly is, yes, don't just talk the whole time. Always leave like 5 to 10 minutes at the end for discussion and land some tangible next steps. Versus, talking all the way through. Buyers always are scheduled back to back to back to back. And if you don't land those, the likelihood of you getting them back on an email or call, you're just leaving a lot of open-ended things. As I always like to land tangible next steps in that meeting, if at all possible. So that's kind of what I call like step one of the sell-in process.
Wait, so Eric, I should not just talk about myself and my story or start with the brand and why my product's oh so great. The
Yes. It is, yes, I mean, it's amazing how, and it's hard, right? And when you're a brand and you get 30 minutes, and that's oftentimes you may not even get there. You may get 20. You want to just, so much, and you want to share all that passion and all the work you've done into it. Is two things. One is, yes, buyers also like to talk, and not just be spoken to. And then second um, is making sure it's not just about your brand, but how your brand is in service of their objectives. Metaphorically speaking, I like to think about like, hey, if this is a home run, what do buyers really want? A lot of times they want to get promoted, right? Like, how can I make this a huge win for you? if I get you excited by this opportunity and we can collectively go at it together, I think that is, tangibly every buyer wants those, career milestones and stuff. And so that's kind of, I always like to frame it up is like, how do we make the buyer successful from a career standpoint and kind of get them aligned to the vision, the strategy. But yeah, so sorry, Jordan. Yes, we can't just talk about ourselves all the time.
I love it. I love it. That's definitely good to know. That's
So
what.
this is, everybody gets the sell in. I think just the biggest ones is just making sure you're trying to speak retailer language. I was on another call yesterday, and the perfect one is it is amazing how many brands haven't actually stepped foot in that retailer store or, website and done the legwork beforehand and being able, buyers love, you kind of just weave in like, oh, I noticed you're doing this. Tell me about that. Why are you merchandising, this better for you section here? What are your thoughts about that? It just showcases you've already done some of that legwork, but it is amazing the amount of brands that haven't even done that effort in advance of those sell-ins. So that's another just simple tactical recommend as well.
I love that. Let alone make sure you change out the retailer's logo and your presentation on. I have heard from buyers that that has
I'm
happened
sure.
before.
Yeah. Yeah, very much. Yeah. Um, all right. So that's selling. I think we get it. I think so. Here's the struggle is you're waiting for a yes. The bigger the retailer, the longer that time it'll be for them to say yes. And so generally speaking, the biggest retailers, that cycle takes about give or take 12 months from when they have the meetings to when the product would show up on shelf. So you have your line review meetings, and so the notion of working with retail buyers is hurry up and wait. They want you to send a follow up, they want you to respond to their emails, but then you're just waiting weeks, and that's could be really um hard is a brand both from a mental space standpoint, but also from a business standpoint. You can't just sit there and wait because oftentimes most retailers, give or take the retailer, their timelines for yes may not work or and oftentimes won't work for what you need to do in terms of preparation for production. So now we're going to kind of talk about like, okay, how do you and what can you do to help get enough signal to help you feel confident enough you're going to move to the next stage, which is really about preparation. And so like is hurry up and wait is the sell in, and it could be months before you get to yes, but then you're in full on sprint mode. Now you're chasing into being ready for retail. And that's kind of what this slide is intended to speak to is okay. So now you really are preparing for retail. And really the biggest things you want to know is door count and SKU count, right? And even ranges. Sometimes you can get buyers to help give you some rough estimates, and that's enough for you at least to go then work with your manufacturers to start production against those types of things. So even pulling out any directional information, um, because your production timelines often are much further out. So if it's 12 months out, most brands need at least 6 months to manufacture. If you're domestic, even longer. If you're bringing stuff from overseas, the retailer, yes, often will come 4 months out from transition date. And then their purchase orders, especially if it's domestic, you're not getting a purchase order for that product until 12 months out. But you need that production again about 9 to 6 months out. And so you need to start that ball rolling much sooner. So, really, on the inventory timelines, let's talk about inventory first, right? And so oftentimes, you're not just planning for that first purchase order, because what's going to happen in biggest retailers, they're going to pull inventory from your 3PL into their distribution network on the first purchase order. More often than not, it depends on retailer. It's usually like a case pack for the most simplest, if it's four, if it's six, they're going to take at least a case pack. Some stores, and depending on the bigger the chains, not all Walmarts sell the same rate. So some stores, they'll put two case packs in, some will just get one. But generally speaking, you have to prepare for that. Plus, you have to have residual inventory sitting there in your 3PL for their ongoing weekly replenishment. So one of the unique things on biggest retailers is they're really ordering every single week, and we'll talk about those weekly orders a little bit more. And so you have to have inventory sat there at your 3PL so that ongoing orders every single week they'll replenish. Now, your biggest PO you'll ever get from a retailer is going to be the set PO. It's also going to be where you're going to have to figure out financing because that's where you're going to have to front the most cash. But then your next week or two will be soft because they have a bunch of inventory. And then eventually retailer systems, and we'll talk more about this, is they just let their systems tell them what to order. And then generally every week it'll kind of start following the path of what sales look like. And obviously smaller retailers, a little bit more manual. Biggest retailers, it's all Dipti can do it better than I can. It's all algorithm and data that drives, from a store level on up, what is the total need I need based off of how things are selling and predicting what upcoming things may happen if it's a seasonal category.
Eric, I think that's just really important thinking about that picture of the graph in terms of that large opening order being the biggest and it dropping down from there and steadily, hopefully increasing. Because I think a lot of people picture that as like a baseline and then giving another single
Yep.
order of about that same size, like a month later or something like that. But that's not the reality of how it typically works because every store will sell different volumes and order at different rates, and so it's really more of that big dip and then a step function probably back up. Is that right?
Yep, 100%. And it's hard because it's never flat. It is this, and it could be a big seasonal event, it could be a big ad, it could be and so you're just gonna have to try your best to triangulate what is an average week. But generally speaking, if you're buying into the retailer's first order, which is usually about, 4 to 6 weeks worth of inventory, I always like to directionally have at least a quarter's worth of inventory for that retailer sitting at the 3PL at the same time, just to give you some buffer, right? The easy answer is I could have a bunch of inventory, but that's not the financially astute answer. So you always got to thread the needle perfectly if possible.
I love
So
that.
then I move into 3PL and logistics. Again, at the biggest one, if we're talking food and beverage, you could probably swap in, instead of 3PL distributors, the UNFIs, the KHEs into this bucket as well. But I think about these and well, I could just do this. Why can't I just ship? I may be shipping my direct to consumer orders, or I may have a 3PL that's doing fine to fill into Amazon FBA in my, small co-ops. Why can't I just use them to ship into Walmart's distribution network? Well, the reality is why I like to think about it is I've never seen a brand win in their first year on logistics. um, you're not winning there, you're winning on product and sell through. But I've seen no shortage of brands who have failed on 3PL ops and logistics, and that can be detrimental for as a brand and company. So I always think about it as it's better to partner with groups that have worked with those retailers already versus trying to teach them. So if I think about my business model as a total, is how do I de-risk as many pieces as possible? The easy one is finding a 3PL that's already worked with the likes of a Costco, Kroger, etc., versus trying to teach your current one if they haven't already, because every retailer has their own specs and requirements from labeling, processes. A lot of times, the biggest retailers require the 3PL to go into their systems and notify or signify if things have shipped. Again, you're just putting a lot of risk there, and so I just think of that group. It's better, and then over time you can continue to optimize for better profit, more efficiency, and those types of things. But that's just one way I think about kind of that component.
Makes a lot of sense.
And then, let's talk EDI. And Dipti will be happy here because EDI for years was probably one of the four-letter words in consumer product goods. These days, tariff is taking, that for most people. But EDI is, a lot of ways, and I'll be the first to say it, haven't been founder operator. I couldn't tell you what EDI is, but it's a necessary step to me getting what I really need, which is the purchase order from the retailer. And so sequentially, it's one of those steps is you get your logistics set up, and then you got to connect the pipes. And I'm going to do the worst description of what EDI is here. So close your ears, please. It's connecting the pipes of the retailer systems into your logistics provider or your your order management system, and that's how they transmit their ongoing information, specifically your weekly orders, etc. So it's a necessary step. Every big retailer really ask you to have that even tested in most instances before ready. But again, until you have that set up, it's preventing them from sending you their first purchase order more often than not. So, yeah, but why is EDI so pivotal? There's all these documents. Retailers have their own little requirements of what those documents are. And the reality is a founder operator. Why EDI is so critical? Because that between your logistics point and your retailers, there is so much cash that is actually locked up when you're shipping POs to the retailer. You're waiting for that retailer to pay you. But if they don't transmit that data correctly, the retailer always say, you shipped 12 units, even though we think we shipped 24. Well, now I'm spending not just cash, but time going back and trying to qualify that, no, we shipped 12 additional units. And so this is, in a lot of ways, the amount of cash and the amount of time as you, as a founder operator, can afford to be spending here. It is for sure behooves you to be intentional about, getting this right. And I've done it where instances, if you're into retail and this isn't right, you're constantly having to go and reconcile invoices against purchase orders, going out into big retailers, vendor portals, then dealing with their accounts payable teams. And oftentimes these days it's a bot that you're dealing with too. And so you can imagine just as a founder and operator, is that where you want to be spending your time? Or are you wanting to spend your time on trying to drive the business in, other things that have more importance? But it's amazing. I spent extra time here is like, it's amazing amount of time that you spend on this or can spend on this if these things aren't connected correctly. And,
Awesome. Appreciate
generally
the
speaking, go ahead.
the
Sorry, Jordan.
overview.
Book off here.
Yeah, I want to bring in Deepti, who's been patiently waiting as well, because I think talking through EDI is a really important part to understand like how brands can do things. And as we were talking through as well, once you're getting set up and kind of making strategic decisions, right? Like that's the role of the buyer at the retailer. Maybe if you're working with the category manager, um, through distributors to really talk through. But when you're talking through the kind of everyday managing orders, those weekly orders that are coming through, a lot of that's happening through data portals and making sure you're ingesting that in. And so, Deepti, I would love for you to share just a little bit about Crystal and EDI and how you think about the role that plays in being successful and working with retailers.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, Eric. So in terms of Crystal, we describe it as a modern B2B commerce network. And in the context of that network, we're very focused on connecting brands slash suppliers, retailers slash buyers, and logistics providers, right? So that's sort of the trifecta, if you will, that we are really focused on. And then as far as EDI is concerned, I mean, obviously, our focus on that comes from just the simple fact that so much of B2B commerce leverages EDI, right? And really what we are doing is we think of EDI as a data language or a data protocol, right? It's not a technology. An analogy, that I'll use sometimes, there's a couple, some folks like one and some folks like the other. It's like English language, which standardizes communication for all of us, right? If the three of us were speaking in three different languages right now, that would make it tricky to communicate, even if there was like real time translation happening because of AI or whatever it might be, right? But just the mere fact of that we all chose to adopt English and speak it just makes it so much easier. EDI is a lot like that, is because a large part of this ecosystem has adopted it. It has network effects, and it has the promise of making it a lot easier for these businesses to transact with each other. And really what the retailers do is, and this was sort of, touched on previously, is every retailer is different. Their business processes are different. Their expectations are different. What they do is they choose to write those rules or express those rules leveraging EDI, right? Much like, for example, every state might express rules for filing taxes, and they choose to do that using the English language, right? So that everybody understands it. In this case, it makes it so that it's easier to basically have one standard that is used by all these different retailers to spell out what those rules are, right? And then where a platform like Crystal comes into the picture is we make it very easy, right? And that's always sort of the ongoing endeavor, but we make it very easy for the suppliers, the logistics providers to follow those rules, right? Because we turn those rules into easy to understand workflows as a first step. And that's really sort of where we come into the picture first. And then, of course, we layer on the platform with integrations to different WMSs or different ERPs, or we even have our own APIs. So that way, if another ERP or WMS or another company wants to build on top of our APIs, that totally works as well, right? And so really then what EDI enables brands to do is to much more easily stay compliant with the supply chain requirements, the retailer requirements. And it has other benefits depending on the retailer or distributor. They may offer you more favorable net terms, for example, right? When you opt to go onto EDI, et cetera. So there are some of those other additional business benefits as well.
Yeah, so I think right, like the way that most brands will interact and most companies interact with EDI is they'll use it to set up the data transfer for new trading partners, new retail partners. That way, retail partners, when they are submitting purchase orders to the brand, it comes through the system and is able to then connect with your WMS or warehouse management software. And then also, so you receive that order, and then you're able to share the documentation for the shipping of that order and the details back to the retailer so they know what's coming, they're receiving their forms back, and you have a record that you received the order and that order's been shipped out to that retailer or distributor.
That's exactly correct. And then including things such as the GS1 128 labels, any packing slips, et cetera, and also the invoice towards the very end.
Yeah, that's important because, right, like every retailer requires very specific things on the physical shipments that go in as well. And it's a nightmare if you have to keep up with that for 10, 20, 40 different retailers. And so this way you actually know, as you've mentioned, like to be compliant of what's going out, make sure everything's getting printed because there are monetary fees and delays that are associated if you're not compliant as well.
That's correct.
Awesome. I love that. Eric, I'm kind of curious, like what's been your experience kind of along with it? Have you seen any brands like run into issues where they're like missing orders that they
Oh,
didn't see
100%. I was
or
just
anything?
gonna like the biggest retailers and Walmart may be the most notorious for on-time shipping fees, but the biggest retailers absolutely charge you fees if you're not shipping in full, if you're not sending the right EDIs. When I talk about cash, that you're gonna get charged or they're gonna take it off the payments they owe you if you're not set up correctly. And then you have to go back. And so for sure, I've had instances of that. And what I love Crystal, and I've known Dipti for a while from the earliest days of her building it, is I've worked across a multitude of the players, and the list isn't that long, and that are in the EDI space. And I'll tell you, I was one, so is Dipsy's eloquently describing EDI and kind of the theory and all those stuff is she's clearly much smarter than I am. But I was one of those founders that came in and I couldn't tell you what this EDI doc was for, or what this requirements were, but I know I needed to do it. And it's amazing how I have people in the brands, and it's okay. I'm one of those, and I don't want to know all the details, but there's many people in the brand space that just don't understand all of those. And I think Crystal by far and away has the most intuitive and simple platform. I'm a very visual person, so they took something that oftentimes was very code driven. I would get email responses back from ADI providers being like, here's our code. I'm like, I don't know what to do with this code in an email. And so they have a very visual forward, modernized platform that it's very intuitive and it's user friendly. And then also I'd say the level of service they wrap around it. I've oftentimes had to be the squeaky wheels with other providers, just be able to get the simple. And again, I'm not looking for rocket science. I'm looking for shipment documents or confirmations or why isn't this case pack pulling through correctly? And then you could imagine just waiting weeks and weeks for some of those responses. Well, on the other time, you're trying to appease your retail partners to say, no, we have the product. We literally just can't get it shipped from point A to point B. And lo and behold, it's because things aren't connected correctly from a pipe standpoint. So I have a huge appreciation for what is clearly not my area of subject matter expertise. But I can confidently say, what they've built and are building with Crystal is a far superior product than I've experienced across other providers.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, like, you wanna make sure those things are right because communication with distributors and buyers can be very slow and delayed, to say the least, and so to get that, like,
Yes.
email response or phone response, it could take a week, it could take 2 or 3 weeks, and then those are fees that you're gonna be charged if you can't figure it out. So you want a system that you can trust because there's real money and real delays behind that, both from, like, they'll charge you fees for out of stock rates, and you'll have lower sales because your product's not on the store shelf.
100% you get hit on both sides. Absolutely. Yep.
Oh my god, so definitely something you need to set up, correctly and work with a good partner who actually
Yes, yeah, it is. It's very foundational, but again, that is not where you want to be spending your time and energy as a brand founder operator for sure. So
I love that. So, Eric, I know we left off talking through what it kind of means to be successful as you're kind of prepping a retailer. Any last things that you want to make sure that we cover or mention?
yeah, one thing I think just kind of playing that now. Okay, so I'm retail buyer in the old days. The bigger the retails, they have buying team, they have an inventory planning team. The reality is they're not there hitting the button Monday mornings. They're leveraging their systems to do that. And so the other big thing is every retailer is building new systems. And oftentimes, so two things I want to talk about is one, your job as a brand is not just to assume that those orders are right. And so sometimes they're not ordering. You're like, well, that's easy. I think you should be ordering. Clearly, we're out of stock. That's an easy one. But the other ones is sometimes you may think it's great, back to kind of your example, Joe, when they're ordering way too much. But in the reality, more often than not, that'll hurt you in the long run because what's going to happen is they may swallow up too much inventory. So now you're not going to be able to fulfill weekly orders because they've taken all of it. And two, they're going to push that out to all their stores. And again, if it's a Walmart, if it's a Target or Kroger, not all their stores sell the same. So they're going to plow a bunch of inventory into a store that may not actually ever sell it through. Well, then you got problems with markdowns, reseller on clearance, and all those types of things. So one recommend is police those orders. That's your job. They don't have time. They have so many brands they have to deal with. They leverage your systems, and they should. But your job is to make sure that you're there helping them say, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. So that's just one recommend. And the last one I didn't, obviously, to dovetail on the whole EAI piece, is the data you put into retailer systems is so pivotal that it's correct. You actually, what you shared, Jordan, you'll get charged if your data isn't correct from weights, dimensions. You'll get charged. So there's that, penalty component of it. But then also that also triggers also all the things. If you're putting in the wrong dimensions into a system, when I worked at Target, they may order 25, but you can only fit 4 on shelf, right? So the importance of data accuracy is the only other thing I just double click on there too is, police those POs and make sure that the data you have in their systems is accurate. You would assume putting in something in one retailer systems, they all talk to each other, and that is absolutely not the case. You may have to put that same thing in there about 4 different times. And, just make sure you're having accuracy on that. So that's really important piece too.
Yeah, no, that's huge. And one thing I always stress that for better or worse, which is probably worse being on the brand side, is that on the brand side of the equation, you're really responsible for your product all the way from ingredient sourcing to the consumer eating it at home. Right. And so if something goes wrong with your ingredients, you're ultimately the one responsible. Manufacturing, you're responsible. With the retailer, you would think that the retailer would know best exactly how much product would fit and their systems would be all dialed in. The reality is it's not. They're a big organization, things change, and you're the one that needs to be responsible because ultimately you're the one as the brand owner who will get hurt by errors, not really the retailer. Like they'll be just fine without you. And
Yep.
so it's on you to make sure, as you mentioned, that data is correct and that's consistent. And if there's any changes, it's updated correctly across every different system so that you don't have those issues later on.
Yep. And then, yeah, so then you're kind of, that's all, you've sold in, you've gotten all the inventory ready, you've gotten all the foundation, your just supply chain, EDI, you've gotten it right, you've gotten your first PO. And the other framework I like to use is that's probably a third of the battle. Now you've unlocked what is now two-thirds of the battle, which is really trying to drive sell through. And I think that's one of those that, that's where you have to be putting and planning. What is your go to market strategy? How will you leverage whether it's, influencers, sampling in store? What are your plans, promotional things? People often like, well, I don't want to promote my brand. Promotions end up being still one of the hardest hitting tactics out there in terms of getting trial or people, especially in the food and beverage categories. But you just know that like once you're there, now the big onus is on you to really figure out how can I drive the velocities to make sure that I've earned my shelf space and I can continue on or even better grow. It seems really simple. Oftentimes brands and aren't really clear with their buyers. What does that measure of success look like? What is that bar you want me to hit so that I know that I can correctly deploy resources against it? More often than not, it's usually a unit velocity. For instance, let's just say the category average may be $10. And so like where do you need to hit at a minimum to really and so that's really simple, but it's amazing how many brands don't have a clear line of what success looks like. So first get that, and then two, make sure you have the right marketing plans in place. Because I think that's these days, more often than not, the brands that are doing the best are not just reliant on the retailer putting a product there to drive velocities. You need to really drive, awareness. And that is, going in founder's story, going into the store, leveraging if retailers have a promotional vehicle, leveraging those, using off-platform promotional things like Ibotta or Aisle, et cetera. I think those are the brands is they have a very robust plan in place. Even if it's, you're a little bit more bootstrapped, you're going in and doing demos yourself. But I think those efforts are the ones that are the brands that are being the most successful and not just being reliant on just being on shelf and letting that drive for your sell through velocities.
Eric, that's so crucial. We've only just begun to touch on what it takes to be successful, but we'll have to do a follow up to go
Sure.
through in more detail, kind of once you're in retail and how to grow, because this stuff is complicated. But I appreciate you being on and sharing those details and a really clear framework for brands to go through. And Deepti, I'm excited to have had you on and talking about how to make sure that you have the proper EDI connections and the foundation for receiving orders, delivery, and shipments so that you can stay compliant with retailers and really put your best foot forward. So thank you both for being on today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If
Pleasure.
you
Thanks, Jordan.
if you are interested and need help with EDI, I definitely recommend talking to Crystal and a special offer for listeners within the Food Baby community. And so check out our show notes for details on how to get set up and make sure you have a strong foundation for your brand.